She stands in the kitchen of their £1,000,000 Surrey home, watching her husband eat the breakfast she just prepared for him. His head is bent forward over the plate. The hammer is already in her hand. What happens in the next 60 seconds will end a 31-year marriage, take a life, and spark a legal revolution that will change how British courts understand domestic abuse forever. But here's what makes this case so deeply unsettling. Sally Challen wasn't a monster. She was a devoted wife, a loving mother, a woman who had spent decades trying to be perfect for the man now sitting at her kitchen table. And Richard Challen wasn't a stranger or a random victim. He was the man she had loved since she was 15 years old, the father of her 2 sons, the person who had shaped every single day of her adult life. This is the story of how a devoted wife became a killer. But more than that, it's the story of how British law finally began to recognize a form of abuse that had been hiding in plain sight for generations. Because what happened to Sally Challen could happen to anyone. And that's what makes this case so terrifying. Sally Challen was born Georgina, though everyone called her Sally. She grew up in a world that felt incomplete. Her father died when she was just 5 years old, leaving a hole in her life that never quite healed. Child psychologists tell us that early parental loss can create what they call attachment anxiety, a deep, sometimes desperate need for connection and stability. For young Sally, that need would shape everything that came after. She was 15 when she met Richard Challen. He was 22, confident, charming, and everything a teenage girl might dream about. He had money, ambition, and a way of making Sally feel like she was the only person in the room. To a girl who had lost her father, who craved that male approval and protection, Richard must have seemed like the answer to everything. But here's what Sally couldn't have known at 15. She wasn't falling in love with a partner. She was being recruited into a role. And Richard Challen was a master at casting. By the time Sally was in her 20s, married with 2 young sons, the pattern was set. This is who Sally Challen was. A woman who had been systematically dismantled over 3 decades. A woman who had been trained from the age of 15 to believe that her worth was determined entirely by one man's approval. A woman who had lost herself so completely that she couldn't imagine a world where she existed independently. Richard Challen was, by all outward appearances, a success story. He was a retired car dealer who had built a comfortable life in Claygate, Surrey, one of those picture-perfect English villages where property values run into the millions and everyone knows everyone else's business. He had money, a beautiful home, 2 grown sons, and a wife who had stood by him for over 3 decades. To the outside world, Richard had it all. But here's the thing about coercive controllers. They're often exceptionally good at managing their public image. They're charming, successful, and well-liked. They know exactly how to present themselves to the world while maintaining a completely different reality behind closed doors. Richard was 22 when he met 15-year-old Sally. That age gap matters, not just legally, though in today's context we might view such a relationship with far more suspicion, but psychologically. Richard wasn't just older. He was already formed, already confident, already established in the world. Sally was still young, still grieving her father, still figuring out who she was. The power imbalance was built into the relationship from day one, and Richard knew how to use that power. Friends and family would later describe Richard as controlling, but in ways that were hard to pin down. He didn't shout or rage or throw things. His control was quieter, more insidious. He would make rules that applied only to Sally, while exempting himself entirely. She couldn't socialize without him, but he could do whatever he wanted. She had to account for every penny, but he spent freely. She had to dress a certain way, act a certain way, be a certain way, but he answered to no one. The infidelity was constant and shameless. Richard maintained profiles on dating websites. He visited brothels. He had affairs with multiple women, sometimes overlapping, sometimes sequential. And when Sally discovered evidence, phone records, receipts, messages, Richard would simply deny it. Not defensively, but with such calm certainty that Sally would end up questioning her own perceptions. This is the hallmark of a skilled manipulator, the ability to make reality itself feel negotiable. 14th of August, the year 2010, a Saturday morning in Claygate, Surrey. The kind of morning that should have been ordinary: breakfast, perhaps some gardening, maybe plans for the weekend. But in the kitchen of the Challen home, something is about to happen that will shatter any illusion of normality. Sally has been back in the house for a reconciliation attempt. Despite everything, the affairs, the humiliation, the years of psychological abuse, she still can't imagine life without Richard. She still loves him, or at least loves the idea of who she thought he was when she was 15 years old. She's trying once again to make the marriage work. Richard asks Sally to go to the shops to get food for breakfast. It's a simple request, the kind of domestic errand that happens in households across the country every day. But Sally feels something, a suspicion, an instinct. Why does he want her out of the house? She goes to the shops. She buys what he's asked for, but the feeling doesn't go away. When she returns, she checks Richard's phone. And there it is, a call to a woman from a dating website, made while Sally was out. Richard had sent her away so he could arrange another liaison. Another affair, another humiliation. Sally confronts him. After 31 years of swallowing her anger, of accepting his explanations, of doubting her own perceptions, she asks him directly about the call. Richard's response is the same as it has always been. He doesn't explain. He doesn't apologize. He doesn't even bother to lie convincingly. Instead, he gives her a command, the kind of command he has been giving her for 3 decades. Don't question me. What happens next? Sally would later say she doesn't fully remember. Psychologists call this dissociation, a mental state where the mind detaches from reality, as a protective mechanism during extreme trauma or stress. But the physical evidence tells the story that Sally's memory cannot. She picks up a hammer. It's not clear where it came from or why it was nearby, but in that moment, it becomes a weapon. And Sally Challen, the devoted wife who has spent 31 years trying to be perfect, who has absorbed every insult and humiliation and betrayal, who has lost herself completely in the service of this man, Sally Challen strikes. She hits Richard as he sits at the table. She hits him again and again and again, 20 times in total. The violence is extreme, shocking, brutal. This is not a single blow in a moment of panic. This is sustained, repeated, relentless. When it's over, Richard Challen is dead. Sally stuffs a tea towel in his mouth. She wraps his body in old curtains. And then, in a gesture that is both heartbreaking and chilling, she writes a note and places it on the body. I love you, Sally. Then she does the dishes. Let that sink in for a moment. After killing her husband in a frenzy of violence, Sally Challen washes the breakfast dishes. It's a detail that speaks volumes about the depth of her conditioning, the automatic nature of her domestic role, the way decades of being Richard's wife had programmed her to clean up, to maintain order, to fulfill her duties no matter what. Sally doesn't try to hide what she's done. She doesn't flee the scene or attempt to create an alibi. Instead, she gets in her car and drives to Beachy Head, the notorious cliff on the south coast of England, where hundreds of people have taken their own lives. She intends to jump. She intends to die, but she doesn't. She thinks of her sons, David and James, and she can't do it. She can't leave them without a mother and a father. So, she turns around and drives home. The next day, she calls the police. When detectives arrive at the Challen home, they find a crime scene that is both horrifying and confusing. The level of violence suggests rage, hatred, a complete loss of control. But Sally herself is calm, cooperative, almost detached. She admits what she's done immediately. She doesn't try to minimize it or excuse it. She simply tells them she killed her husband. The investigation that follows is in many ways straightforward. There's no mystery about who committed the crime. Sally has confessed. The forensic evidence is clear. But as detectives begin to interview family members, friends, and neighbors, a more complicated picture starts to emerge. David and James Challen tell police about their father's behavior, the affairs, the control, the psychological abuse. They describe a marriage that looked normal from the outside but was deeply dysfunctional behind closed doors. They talk about their mother's multiple attempts to leave and how Richard always pulled her back. They explain that Sally had been completely dependent on Richard emotionally and psychologically since she was a teenager. Friends corroborate the story. They describe Richard as controlling and Sally as increasingly isolated. Some mention that they had worried about Sally's mental state in the months leading up to the killing. She had seemed anxious, depressed, not quite herself. But here's the problem. In the year 2010, none of this mattered in the eyes of the law. Coercive control wasn't a crime. Psychological abuse wasn't recognized as a form of domestic violence. The legal system had no framework for understanding how decades of manipulation and gaslighting could drive someone to kill. Sally's defense team argued for diminished responsibility, a legal concept that reduces a murder charge to manslaughter if the defendant's mental state was significantly impaired at the time of the killing. They presented psychiatric evidence showing that Sally suffered from depression and had been in an extremely fragile mental state. But the prosecution painted a different picture. They characterized Sally as a jealous wife who had killed her husband in a fit of rage over his infidelity. They pointed to the level of violence, 20 blows with a hammer, as evidence of intent and malice. They argued that Sally had known exactly what she was doing and had chosen to kill Richard rather than simply leave him. The jury believed the prosecution. In the year 2011, Sally Challen was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 22 years, later reduced to 18 on appeal. She was 64 years old. If she served the full sentence, she would be 82 before she was eligible for release. But the story doesn't end there, because while Sally sat in prison, the world outside was changing. In the year 2015, the UK government passed a law making coercive and controlling behavior in intimate relationships a criminal offense. Suddenly, there was a legal framework for understanding exactly what Richard Challen had done to Sally for 31 years, and that would change everything. What would you have done if you were on that jury? Would you have seen a jealous killer or an abused woman pushed beyond her breaking point? Let us know in the comments. Sally Challen spent 9 years in prison, 9 years of lockups and prison food and shallow stairs and doors she couldn't open. 9 years of therapy and psychiatric treatment, and slowly, painfully beginning to understand what had happened to her. Because here's something crucial. When Sally killed Richard, she didn't fully understand that she had been abused. She knew the marriage was unhappy. She knew Richard had affairs. She knew he criticized and controlled her. But she didn't have the language or the framework to recognize it as abuse. She thought it was just marriage. She thought it was normal. She thought it was her fault. In prison, Sally participated in programs about domestic violence and coercive control. She worked with therapists who helped her understand the dynamics of her relationship with Richard. And slowly she began to see her own life with new eyes. She began to understand that what Richard had done to her, the gaslighting, the isolation, the humiliation, the control, wasn't normal. It was abuse, and it had been happening since she was young. David Challen, Sally's younger son, became her fiercest advocate. He launched a campaign to have his mother's case reviewed, working with Justice for Women, a feminist legal organization that supports women who have been convicted of killing violent partners. David spoke publicly about his father's behavior, about the coercive control his mother had endured, about the ways the legal system had failed to understand what had really happened in that kitchen. In the year 2017, Sally's legal team submitted new grounds for appeal. They presented fresh psychiatric evidence showing that Sally had been suffering from multiple undiagnosed mental health conditions at the time of the killing, including bipolar disorder, dependent personality disorder, and adjustment disorder. They also presented expert testimony about coercive control and how it could explain Sally's actions. The first appeal was denied, but Sally's team persisted. In March the year 2018, they made an oral application to the Court of Appeal, the last chance to challenge the conviction. And this time, 3 judges granted permission for a full appeal hearing. It was a historic moment. This was believed to be the first time that coercive and controlling behavior would be considered relevant in an appeal against a murder conviction in the UK. The case attracted massive media attention. Queues formed outside the courtroom. The case had to be moved to a larger room to accommodate everyone who wanted to attend. In February the year 2019, the Court of Appeal heard the new evidence. Sally's lawyers argued that the original trial had failed to properly consider the impact of Richard's abuse on Sally's mental state. They presented expert testimony explaining how coercive control works, how it traps victims, how it can lead to extreme acts of violence when the victim finally breaks. The judges listened, and on 28th of February, the year 2019, they made their decision. Sally Challen's murder conviction was quashed. The case would be sent back for a retrial, but there wouldn't be a retrial. In June the year 2019, the Crown Prosecution Service made a decision that acknowledged the strength of the new evidence. They agreed to accept Sally's plea to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Sally was sentenced to 9 years and 4 months, almost exactly the time she had already served. On 7th of June, the year 2019, Sally Challen walked out of court a free woman. She was 65 years old. She had spent nearly a decade in prison, but she was free. The scenes outside the court were emotional. Sally was supported by her 2 sons, David and James, both of whom had stood by her throughout the ordeal. David spoke to the media, his voice breaking with emotion. He talked about his mother's suffering, about his father's abuse, about the thousands of other women in prison who might be serving the wrong sentence because the legal system doesn't understand coercive control. It also has exemplified how the criminal justice system continues to discriminate against women who kill. Sally herself gave a statement, and this is where something remarkable happened. Instead of simply expressing relief or gratitude, Sally used her moment in the spotlight to advocate for other women. She talked about the women she had met in prison who had similar stories, women who had killed abusive partners and were serving life sentences because their cases had never been properly understood. Many other women who are victims of abuse as I was are in prison today serving life sentences. And I know this because I've met them. They have suffered abuse and other miscarriages of justice and should be serving sentences for manslaughter, not murder. She said she wanted to use her freedom to help them. I want to keep campaigning, she said. I want to raise awareness about coercive control. Today, Sally lives quietly in Essex with her older son, James, and his wife. She's learning to live independently for the first time since she was 15 years old. She's learning to make her own decisions, to choose her own clothes, to decide what she wants to eat and when she wants to eat it. These are things most of us take for granted, but for Sally, they're revolutionary. She attends church. She does Pilates and yoga. She's thinking about getting a dog. She's met her first grandson, who was born 3 months after her release. She's building a life that is entirely her own, free from Richard's control for the first time in 50 years. But it's not easy. Sally still struggles with anxiety and depression. She still has nightmares. She still, in some ways, loves Richard, or at least the idea of who she thought he was. That's what coercive control does. It doesn't just trap you physically. It traps you emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. Even after the abuser is gone, the effects linger. Sally continues to work with Justice for Women and other organizations advocating for women in prison. She speaks publicly about her case when she can, though she finds it difficult. Every time she tells her story, she has to relive the trauma. But she does it anyway because she knows there are other women out there, women sitting in prison cells right now, who need the same second chance she got. As for the legal system, Sally's case has had a profound impact. The Criminal Cases Review Commission has reopened over 3,000 murder cases to examine whether coercive control might have been a factor. Lawyers, judges, and prosecutors are being trained to recognize the signs of psychological abuse. The conversation about domestic violence has expanded beyond physical violence to include the invisible prison of coercive control. Sally Challen is free. But the question remains, how many other women are still trapped, either in abusive relationships or in prison cells, because society still doesn't fully understand what coercive control really is? If you or someone you know is experiencing coercive control, please reach out for help. You don't have to wait until it becomes physical violence. Trust your instincts. And remember, abuse that leaves no bruises is still abuse. The Sally Challen case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about relationships, power, abuse, and justice. It doesn't offer easy answers, but it does offer important lessons if we're willing to listen. First, we need to expand our understanding of what domestic abuse looks like. For too long, society has focused almost exclusively on physical violence. We look for bruises, broken bones, hospital visits. But coercive control can be just as damaging, just as dangerous, just as deadly, and it leaves no visible marks. Coercive control is about power and domination. It's about one person systematically stripping another person of their autonomy, their independence, their sense of self. It can include financial control, isolation from friends and family. This marriage seems completely different to the one you had with Richard. Can you explain a little how or why? With Richard, I never knew what mood he would be in when he came home. I had to walk on eggshells. I was frightened of saying the wrong thing and upsetting him, and then he would get angry with me. With Dell, it's totally different. We're happy. We're happy from when we get up and we're happy when we go to bed. Out of the shadows of a quiet English village, this case exploded into the public eye like a thunderclap, ripping open decades of hidden pain and forcing the world to stare at the ugly face of invisible chains. It wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was a wildfire that started with one son's unyielding fight, spreading through media storms, activist rallies, and legal halls until it scorched old laws to ashes, birthing new protections that echo louder with every retold whisper, proving that one shattered life can shatter systems, turning silent suffering into a roaring call for change that hits harder, deeper, fiercer each time you hear it.